Good evening. There we go. It's good to see everybody out tonight. Chris Kelly walked up here with the microphone, and he said he'd been telling everybody he was on the praise team tonight. He's not. He's the backup teacher. I didn't tell him that when I gave him the microphone, but something happens to me and I fall out, he's got to jump up and start. We're glad you're here. If you'll be opening up your Bibles to Mark chapter 10, we're continuing our study of the Gospel of Mark, and tonight's lesson, we're going to try to keep in the time frame that we're allowed. I've been trying to teach this lesson for 4 weeks now. 3 weeks ago, I was sick as a dog, and Webb substituted for me, and I thought, well, I'll just do it next week. And then about Monday of that week, we remembered that was when David Shannon was coming, and I said, well, I'll just have an. And then last week, we had the winter storm come. Of course, Wayne Berger called me today. He's coming to do our evangelism seminar this weekend. He said, what's the weather look like? And I said, you got me. I said, we canceled services last week for ice, and it's 72 today. So, just pack a little bit of everything, and you ought to be covered, I guess. But anyway, so we're in Mark chapter 10. We're still talking about, remember, the overall theme of denying self and following Jesus. And as we have gone through this, we've tried to show how that there's this kind of emphasis on the first half of the fact proving that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's where we had so many of the miracles. The second half of the book that really transitioned towards the end of chapter 8 whenever he told the disciples, if any man would follow me, take up his cross, deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And the rest of this has kind of been showing how to do that by showing who the Messiah is. So the first half he showed that he was the Messiah through the miracles that he performed. And now the second half of the book, there's less miracles, a lot more teaching, and he's trying to show them what it means that he is the Messiah. That it's not the idea that they had in their mind of this mighty warrior king that was going to kick the Romans out and lead Israel back to prominence, but rather it was a suffering Savior. And how that he's been willing to deny himself and let God reign in his life, and we should too. Well, we've, about a month ago now that it's been, we started this big section, and we looked at in chapter 9:35 and in chapter 10 and verse 44, there's these bookends of this huge teaching section where in 9:35 and in 10:44, Jesus tells the disciples if anyone would be first, then he should be willing to be second and servant to all. And the disciples are really struggling right now with not understanding. They understand that Jesus is Messiah. You remember in chapter 8 when Jesus asked them, who do people say that I am? And they told him, who do you say that I am? And Peter was the one that said, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. But do you really understand what that means? Because they're still... right as soon as Peter gets done with that, he tells Jesus, you're not going to go to Jerusalem and suffer. No one's going to put you to death. And Jesus, you remember, had to get on to him. There's this constant bickering and fighting between the disciples about who's going to be the most important, who's the best disciple or the greatest disciple, because in their mind, when Jesus becomes king, if I can establish myself as the top of his cabinet, then that just means more power, influence, money, all of those kinds of things for me. So they're not getting it. So this huge section, 9:35 to 10:44, that begins and ends with, if you want to be first, then you got to be willing to be a servant to all. You got to be willing to take second place. You've got to not try to be the king of your life. Remember, we talked about way early in this discussion in Mark, those imperial butter commercials where they would dun-da-da-dun and the crown would appear above their head. Well, that's what we want to do. We think about the way we want things to be, and then we dun-da-da-dun, we want to put the crown on us rather than on the king himself. And that's part of the problem with the disciples. So that leads us to chapter 10 and verses 1 through 12, where we're going to start this evening. But sometimes when we see in our Bibles chapter 10 and verse 1, and we move from one chapter to the next, if we're not careful, we sometimes kind of Well, he's done with that thought process, and now we're going to move on to a different subject. And it's not a different subject. It's a different topic, but it fits in this overall theme, in part because if you look at the very end of chapter 9, he talks in verse 50, he says, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. So one way that this teaching on divorce fits in what Mark is trying to do in telling us the story of Jesus is anytime there's divorce, there's not peace among ourselves, right? So it fits certainly in that way, but it's also, I think, going to show a different aspect of this denying self and letting God reign. So Jesus is going to be challenged on divorce in these first 12 verses of chapter 10 by the Pharisees, and there's going to be some teaching. This is the parallel of Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. And whenever you talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, it's an emotional topic and an emotional subject, and there's no way in 45 minutes tonight we could completely cover every aspect or issue. But when you think about what Jesus teaches, and then later on what Paul's going to teach in 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, when you think about what's taught in the New Testament, when it relates to marriage, divorce, and remarriage, at face value at least, it's very clear what Jesus is saying. Now what happens is I don't know that there's an issue that we can study in the Bible that has more emotion that's involved. And what happens a lot of times is that preachers or elderships or congregations or whatever, we're pretty set on what the Bible teaches about marriage, divorce, and remarriage until it happens to my son or to my daughter or whatever, and then we want to restudy the issue. And I've never seen an issue like that restudied where they come back and say, yep, we had it right. It's always we restudy it and we come back and we're going to have a different standard than what we've looked at before. So having said all that, don't think that as we're looking at this that Jesus or that I am being callous in any way. There's not a family in this room that in some way, maybe some closer than others obviously, but there's not a family in this room that hasn't been touched by divorce. And it's obviously in our country, it's become a very difficult problem to face. In our state, which has one of the highest divorce rates even in the country, it's a problem for us. And so it's something we need to understand what the Bible teaches about. But again, understand in context what Mark is talking about is, are you going to let God reign? Are you willing to be second? Are you going to demand to have it your way? See? And that's an important concept to remember when we think about this. So in verse 1 it says, and he left there and he went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again and again, as was his custom, he taught them. So you've got Jesus left there where he had been teaching with his disciples. They had that whole conversation about the guy that was casting out demons, not according to what they wanted, the disciples wanted, and had that whole conversation with them about that and some of the pride issues that they were facing. He left there and he goes to Judea. And again, we've got this idea that we've seen and we've tried to point it out time and time again as we've gone through Mark. These crowds that keep growing, people keep coming to Jesus, in part because of the miracles that he's performed, in part because there's a lot of people running around now thinking this must be the Messiah. And again, a lot of them don't get that concept of what Messiah actually means, but they're thinking that he is. A lot of people are just curious. A lot of people have heard about the way he teaches, which is especially interesting when we're dealing another time that the Pharisees have challenged him how differently he taught than the Pharisees taught. And that's especially true when we talk about marriage and divorce and remarriage, because the way the Pharisees taught was that they aligned themselves mainly with two well-known Pharisees and their writings and their teachings, and I'll I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But they're gathering to hear him. And it's interesting, I think, to note what Mark says here at the end. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. This has become Jesus' custom. Earlier in Mark, he said, we got to go to the next village so we can teach. That's what he said back in chapter 1, that's the reason that I came, was to preach or to teach about the kingdom of God, the rule and reign of God. He didn't come to just perform miracles. He didn't come to end disease or to cure all illnesses or whatever. The purpose of his coming was to teach and to preach to others. And so he gets to a new place and he does what he typically does, and he teaches. And so the Pharisees come to him, and notice why they come to him. Over and over again we see this. The Pharisees are coming to Jesus not because I want to learn better what God's will for my life is, not because I want to engage in some honest intellectual conversations with you. They've come in order to test Jesus or to trick Jesus or to tempt Jesus. They're here to try to make Jesus look bad. Remember, they're still trying to ruin his reputation. And so how can we do that? Well, if we can figure out the perfect question to ask him, the question that is so tricky that no matter which way he answers, we've got him. Well, this question that they ask him to test him is a really good question, you would think at least, for that. The question is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, Mark doesn't include it in his account of it. Matthew tells us that the Pharisees ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause or for any reason? And you would think this would be a pretty good a good question to trick Jesus on, because I've talked about the Mishnah before, which is like the commentary that the Pharisees had written on the Old Testament. In the Mishnah, there's a tract called the Getted that in chapter 9 of it is devoted to divorce and remarriage. And there were basically two households of Pharisees that were most prominent in their understanding of what was going on. If you turn in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 24, that's where the discussion comes in on all of this, is in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. When they looked back at what Moses wrote in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy 24, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and then he goes on to talk about if he becomes another man's wife and whatnot. Well, there were, again, two primary Pharisees that debated about this. There was the house of Hillel. And the house of Hillel, what they focused on in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1 was if she finds no favor in his eyes. So their way of explaining this verse is that's the most important phrase in Deuteronomy 24. If she finds no favor in his eyes. That if there comes a point when the wife no longer is desirable to the husband, then he can divorce her, basically for any reason. And so, like Scotty pointed out a few weeks ago, they had all of these different kinds of laws and additions to the laws and explanations of the laws they came up with. And so they went so far as to say that, if he found that she was not beautiful in his eyes, which beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, right? So he could literally be married to the most beautiful woman, the winner of the Miss Israel pageant from, the year 30 A.D., and he say, well, I don't think she's as pretty as that woman, so he could divorce her. If she burnt his supper, then, he didn't like the way she prepared a meal or something of that nature. Then at that point, she could have no favor in his eyes and he could divorce her. Melody and I have been married now for 25 and a half years. And in 25 and a half years, let me tell you how, well, I better not tell you about all our males, so she may be listening in. But you think about all the little things, if you've been married for any length of time, that has gone on in your marriage, any little thing where she didn't find favor in my eyes, then I can divorce her. So that was more, if you like these labels, and I don't really like these labels, but that would be the more kind of liberal mindset. On the other hand, there was the more conservative mindset, and that was the house of Shammai. And what he focused on in this verse is he has found some indecency in her. And so what Shammai taught was that indecency or immorality meant that the only reason that you could say she didn't find favor in your eyes is if she committed adultery, if she cheated on you. So this went back and forth, and the people would align themselves under whichever Pharisee they agreed with's teaching. Well, guess which one of those the majority of the people aligned themselves with, or at least the majority of men aligned themselves with? It was with Hillel. And that was the overriding consensus in the time of Jesus, was that any guy that just decided he didn't find favor in his eyes about his wife for any reason, he didn't like her and wanted to divorce her, he could divorce her. So again, you go back to our text in Mark chapter 10, and you think about this idea that they came to test him. What a brilliant question to ask, because Jesus is probably going to quote one of these, he's going to align himself with one of these Pharisees. I mean, that's the two ways of thinking about this. And if Jesus aligns himself with Hillel, then the Pharisees can say, now look at that Jesus. He's just taking the liberal point of view, and he's not taking into full effect all of the things that Moses had taught in Deuteronomy 24:1. We got him, right? On the other hand, if he sides with the house of Shammai, then they can say, look at him. Everyone, the vast majority is in agreement with Hillel that this is the way that it is. And so Jesus is showing he doesn't know much if he doesn't agree with the majority of us. See, either way he answered, with those two choices, they thought they had him. But that's not how Jesus answered. So they asked if it was lawful. If you notice verse 3, then notice what Jesus asks them in return. Jesus was good about this a lot of times, that he would answer a question with a question and make them think. And he asked them, well, what did Moses command you? If you want to know what's lawful, then why are you asking me? Go look at the law. And you don't have to have any question about it, right? And they had become so focused on, and we've talked about this several times in this class, on the tradition of the fathers, on what the different Pharisees taught. That became what was important to them rather than what the actual law said. And Jesus asked this question more than once as he's dealing with Pharisees and others. What did Moses write? Hadn't you read what Moses, don't you know what Moses said? And his question is never really asking them because I don't know if they're the Pharisees. I know you've read what Moses has said, but have you really listened to what he said? Have you paid attention to what he said? Has that been your focus, or what your traditions says? And so they said Moses, and they quote basically what is said in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Sometimes people make a little bit of an issue about Moses' command and Moses permitted, but if you go to Matthew, they're swapped in the two sayings there, so it's synonymous with each other. It's not that this was Moses' opinion. Moses is writing by inspiration of God. But Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. The problem isn't what Moses said. The problem is what they've, in the Mishnah, have come up with, all their opinions that they've added to how they understand what this particular teaching says. That's the issue. And, Moses allowed them. That gives people some heartburn a little bit. If God wants it one way, then why did he allow something else? Well, a couple of ways to look at that. First of all, there's been times in which God wanted it to be one way, but He knew because of the hardness of their heart that they weren't going to have it that way, and so He would allow them to take the path that they wanted to take. For example, when it came to having a king, God didn't want them to have a king. He wanted to be their king. But He knew their hearts were going to be hardened and they'd want to be like the nations around them, so He allowed them to have a king. God told them not to kill, not to murder, to take someone's life, someone innocent's life. But at the same time, God in the law of Moses allowed for, once you murdered someone, to how to go about, if you're the person that took someone's life, how you could prove that it was by an accident, or these cities of refuge you could go to, and all of those things. It's kind of like in A Few Good Men, whenever Jack Nicholson's saying, I told them there would be no code reds, so there's no code reds. And then Tom Cruise says, well, if you said there's no code reds and your word's always taken, then why did you have to emphasize it again? And you can't handle the truth. Well, the Pharisees can't handle the truth. That, God's allowing them because He knows that what they're going to do, and so He's allowing the understanding of what needs to be done when they don't follow what He says. And so Jesus reminds them of that in verse 5. He says, and because of the hardness of your heart, He wrote you this commandment. But notice the way the beginning of verse 6 starts. But there's this contrast. He wrote you this commandment because He's the king. He's the one that makes the commandments. But from the beginning, that's not the way that He wanted it to be. So they're saying, let's go back to the law of Moses and see what the standard for marriage, divorce, and remarriage should be. And Jesus is saying, it's good to go back and to see what God originally wanted, but you're not going back far enough to find out what God actually wanted. Instead, He says from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So think about what He's saying here. Is He's saying that God, when He created, He could have created any situation, couldn't He? But the fact that He created a certain situation ought to be indicative of the fact that this is the way that God wants it. God could have created a bunch of men and bunch of women and said, you don't have to mate for life. You can just go around and mate with anybody who you want for however length of time you want and change as often as you want. But the fact that He created a male and a female would indicate that's not what He wanted, right? Right? The fact that He created not two men or two women would indicate that's not what He wanted, right? The fact that He created a male and a female would indicate that His plan from the beginning was there to be a relationship between one man and one woman that would last for the entirety of their lifetime. From the beginning, that's the way that God had it set forth. So He says, therefore, in verse 7, and every time you see therefore, you have to think about what was written before. Because God made one man and one woman at the very beginning, He says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so they're no longer two, but one flesh. So there's going to come a point in your life when, guys, you're going to leave mama and daddy. That's the first step in this. And part of our problems that we have in the homes oftentimes is we're not willing to leave mama and daddy behind. We need to leave mama and daddy. We need to cleave to our spouse or hold fast to his wife is what he says in the ESV. But it's a negative word. The word is actually the word for like a meat cleaver kind of deal. So not cutting in two. You're going to be joined together. You're going to be glued together. And the two shall become one flesh. Now, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about this one flesh is talking about the sexual relationship. One thing we have to understand is that sex is not what makes a marriage, nor is sex on its own what ends a marriage. And we'll get back to that last part here in just a minute. But if Melody and I got married in this church building, And immediately after whoever married us, Jared said, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. And we smooched and we walked out that door to get in our car to run off on our honeymoon. And a Mack truck came through and ran over me, and I was paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of my life. And a physical, intimate relationship was never possible between Melody and I. Are we still married? See, it's not about sex. It's not what makes the marriage. This idea of one flesh is more than that. Now, this points out a basic fundamental principle in Bible study of why we need to stay within a text to identify terms. Because when you get over to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul's going to use this idea of one flesh as a sexual relationship. That's not what Jesus is doing here, though. Notice how he defines it. He says, the two shall become one flesh. They're no longer two, but one flesh. And then in verse 9, he says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. It's that God has put you together. And it's kind of like, maybe you've seen, I don't know how many weddings I've done, and there's all sorts of different, at some point in the marriage, some different way in which we'll try to symbolize what's happening in that ceremony, lighting a unity candle, or I did one wedding where they had 3 ropes hanging off a board, and one represented the bride, and one represented the husband, and one represented God, and they were going to braid it, and they were holding hands, so she's using her hand, and he's using a hand, and he don't know how to braid because he's a guy, and we stood there for at least 17 minutes, like this, while they're trying to braid there. At one point, she finally kind of just, finished it up. But one of my favorite things, though, that they'll do, sometimes you'll see them, there'll be a canister of blue sand and a canister of pink sand. Have you seen that before? And they'll pour it together, and it's all intermingled with each other. Well, when he talks about joining together, let not man separate, the idea behind this is, you think about how tedious and time-consuming and almost impossible it would be to take that large canister and divide the pink and blue sand grains completely and perfectly. Would you want that job? I'd just soon you dump a 5-gallon bucket of glitter in my house, or devil's dust as I like to call it. But you talking about a tedious, awful job. Once you've poured that sand in there, there's no separating it. They're together. And that's the idea that he's talking about. Once you're together, you're one. It's very few times do I hear anybody talk about Corey anymore. It's Corey and Melody. In fact, sometimes it gets run together and you think it's one word, Corey and Melody, And that's good. That's the way it should be. That's the way people should think of us, that it's not just me or just Melody, it's Corey and Melody. And that's the idea here. But notice he says, what therefore God has joined together. God is the king. Remember, Jesus came preaching the rule and reign of God. The king has said these two are put together. But what the Pharisees have done is they've put themselves in the unjoining business. And so if the king says these two are together, and now I'm saying we can separate them, then what have I done? I've bumped the king off the throne and I've said, dun, 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 I'm king. My authority means more than what his is. That's the problem. So I even got creative because I've had 4 weeks to do it. I drew a meat cleaver on there. That's the idea behind that separate word. It's the cleaver word. You do not cleave it apart. Again, thinking God's rule and reign. So in verse 10, after he has this discussion with the disciples about all of this, then they go on in the house, and the disciples asked him again about this matter. And remember what we've talked about over and over in the book of Mark. Disciples always ask the questions, right? The disciples are always wanting to know more. They're always seeking deeper knowledge. They're wanting to figure it out. They're wanting more information. And so they asked him about this matter. In fact, when you get to Matthew, and we're going to flip over to Matthew in just a minute, but when you get over to Matthew, and I can't remember if I put this on here or not, so this may be redundant, but when you get to Matthew, when they walk away from the Pharisees, the disciples look at Jesus and they say, this is kind of the Corey Sawyer's paraphrase Bible, but they're like, if that's the case, who in the world can get married? If it's as strict as what you're saying. Now, Mark doesn't give us the exception to the rule. He's just given us the rule. In Matthew chapter 19, of course, he gives us the exception to the rule, and that's the innocent party in a marriage relationship where the other person, the spouse, is committed adultery. If the spouse commits adultery, if they commit sexual sin with someone outside of that marriage relationship, then that innocent party has the right to divorce and remarry, and they're innocent. The person who's committed adultery, he's fixing to say, doesn't have that right. And so the disciples asked Jesus, if that's how strict it is, that you're, this sounds funny. I'm sure if Peter's wife was walking along beside him, she probably elbowed him if he's the one that asked this. If I've got to stick with her forever, then who would want to get married? Well, all the wives are going, But in their way of thinking in that time, it was if she doesn't find favor in your sight, you can divorce her at any time and have somebody else. And now you're telling me that if we marry someone, that I've got to stick with that person, even if she burns supper tomorrow night, even if she's not the prettiest girl in town anymore, even if I find something wrong with her, I'm supposed to stick with her? So they're asking him about this matter. They're confused. So verses 10 through 11, he says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Why? Because you are, in context of what he's talking about in Mark, you're in rebellion to the king. What God has put together, you don't be in the business of unjoining. You don't have the right to say, well, I think it ought to be. And that's what we do a lot of times with our arguments. Yeah, I know that's what it says, but I think. Yeah, I know that's what it says, but wouldn't it be better if? Yeah, but I think God would want me to be happy, or him to be happy, or her to be happy. You know what God really wants us to be? Is holy. He wants us to be in submission to him as the king. And so that's in the context of 9:35 to 10:44. Whoever wants to be first must be second and servant of all. You've got to let the king reign. And once the king puts you together, we're not in the business of unjoining. And again, there's the exception, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But that ought to be our focus when it comes to marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Now, if you look over Matthew chapter 19, and I did put verse 10 in there. When you look over at Matthew chapter 19, his account, he gives a little bit more detail about that conversation they had in the house that I think helps maybe to understand this a little bit more. The disciples said, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it'd be better not to marry. See, they got how difficult this is. And one of the things I always ask guys that have maybe a less stringent way of looking at marriage, divorce, remarriage than what I'm teaching to you that Mark 10, Matthew 19 says, is I always ask them, if Jesus was teaching what you were teaching, would the disciples be shocked and say that would be a difficult thing? That's something to consider, I think. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying. What saying? The saying that they just said, that it's better to not marry. Because when you get over to 1 Corinthians, Paul's going to say it's better to marry than to burn in your lusts and your passions. Not everyone can remain celibate for their whole life. God put a desire in us for a physical, intimate relationship. And, as Paul would talk about it, the people that can bring themselves into subjection so much that they can live a lifetime without ever marrying, that's a gift from God, as Paul would put it, that they would be able to focus on the kingdom or whatnot. But Jesus says not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given, this gift from God. And then he says in verse 12, for there are eunuchs. And some of you are sports fans, and you'll remember Allen Iverson. We talking about practice? We talking about eunuchs? Is he really talking about eunuchs here? The word for at the beginning of verse 12, a lot of times when you see people give an explanation of Matthew 19, they stop at verse 11. But that for at the beginning of verse 12 tells us it's connected to the flow of thought of the conversation he's been having. What he's given here is an illustration of what he's been saying. He's not talking about literal eunuchs, but he's using eunuchs, and those of you that are not familiar with what a eunuch is, it's someone who was made to be in submission to a king. He would have a princess or a queen or whatever, that he needed men there in her court because the women that she had in her court wouldn't necessarily be able to protect her from anyone that would attack. So you wanted men in her court that could protect her. But the king also wanted to make sure they weren't men that would have sexual desires for the queen. So they would make them a eunuch. And you can go, when you go home online, and we're not in mixed company, and you can study more about that if you'd like to. We had one time in a teenage class, I was teaching, we're in a section in the New Testament that talked about circumcision, and I had a girl raise her hand. She said, "What is circumcision?" And I said, "You need to ask your mom and daddy when you get home." And then later on, I get a call from that woman's mom, and she said, "You know, I was really mad at you tonight." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "On the way home, my daughter told me that she asked a question in class that Mr. Corey wouldn't answer, and I got mad at you. Why won't Corey answer that question?" And she said, "What did you ask?" And she told me, and then I was thinking, I'm so glad Mr. Corey didn't answer that question. So there's some questions you need to study on your own. But anyway, these eunuchs were put in, they didn't want this necessarily, they didn't desire this necessarily, but because of their service to the king, they were in a position that they were not going to be in a sexual relationship. Okay? So notice what he says in verse 12. For, that for connects it back to whatever he said, the first 11 verses here. There are eunuchs. Notice he says it 3 different times. There are eunuchs. First of all, there are eunuchs who have been made so from birth. Now, who's that? Well, that's the ones that he talked about earlier that could receive it. That's the ones that Paul talks about that never had to get married, and it's a gift from God that they didn't have to be in that physical relationship with a spouse, that they could focus on the kingdom or whatever. It could potentially be talking about people that are born with some sort of physical handicap to where they couldn't have an intimate relationship with someone. But I think more than that, it's probably talking about the people that don't necessarily have to. And I've known those people. Neil Pollard, that spoke in our summer series last year, is a good friend of mine, did a lesson at Polishing the Pulpit several years ago about the value of the unmarried in our congregations or something like that. Because sometimes, not intentionally, we make people that never get married feel like there's something wrong with them. And we shouldn't do that. There's lots of good that can be done. I know of a man that has had a very successful career. He's been very wealthy, but because he's never chosen to marry, he's been a faithful man of God his whole life. He lives in a single wide trailer, and I don't know how many thousands of dollars that he's given to good works and missionaries and that type of thing. So there's those. There are those eunuchs that have been made so from birth that didn't have that. Then he says there are eunuchs that have been made eunuchs by men. So who's that? Well, that's like if, for example, Melody comes in tonight and she says, "I just don't like you anymore. I'm just going to divorce you, and I can't stand, I got my sense of smell back, and I see what I've been, I just can't deal with it, buddy, and I'm leaving." And she hasn't had an adulterous relationship. She hadn't cheated on me. And doesn't plan to. She doesn't want to be married anymore. She just wants to be on her own. Well, in that situation, what's my options? 1 Corinthians 7, I can be reconciled to my spouse, or I can be celibate the rest of my life. I didn't want that. I didn't choose that, but I was made to be a eunuch by someone else. Are you with me? You with me? And then the third category, there are some who are eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So who's that? Well, let's say that I were to cheat on my wife. I have an adulterous relationship. And Melody, as is her right to do, divorces me and marries someone else. Jesus told the disciples that if I leave my wife and I marry someone else, I've committed adultery, right? So if I'm going to, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, if I'm going to bring myself under the rule and reign of God, guess what my choices are? I can be a eunuch. I can be celibate the rest of my life. Now, whose fault is that? Me. I made myself, I put myself in that situation. By the way, I said earlier, sex doesn't begin a marriage. Sex doesn't end a marriage either. You don't have to, if you're the innocent party, you don't have to divorce a guilty spouse, but you can. Now, if someone is penitent and they ask you for forgiveness, you have to forgive them, but there's a difference in forgiveness and consequences of sin, and we have to understand that. If I commit murder tonight, and if you've raised teenage boys, you can understand why that might be a temptation. If I commit murder tonight, I can get forgiveness for that, but guess what? I'm still going to jail. There's still consequences. Are you with me? So that person has to be forgiven, but they don't have to be taken back. If as the innocent party you want to take them back, you can. But if the innocent party chooses not to, then I've been made a eunuch by myself. Now, why I think this is important is because here again, whenever I have people trying to tell me, yeah, it's not really that stringent, I say, well, following your plan, how can you fit this illustration, all three categories, into your plan? And I've had some guys honest enough to say, I can't. Well, what does that tell you? Either Jesus was really bad at giving illustrations, I don't think that's it, do you? Or you hadn't figured out exactly what he's teaching here. So, again, the point of what Jesus is addressing here is not as much teaching about marriage, divorce, remarriage, although he does, but what he's really trying to get them to understand is this line here about for the sake of the kingdom of heaven is, are we willing to let God reign and rule? We can say all day, well, I don't like that, or I wish it wasn't that way, or that seems really difficult for me, or that seems hard to swallow, or whatever it might be. But ultimately, it's not about us understanding the why as much as submitting to what he says. Does that make sense? So, again, this is in a bigger context, and I hope next week, because we've lost a couple weeks especially, you'll take the time between now and next Wednesday to read verses 13 through 31. We may try to sneak down and get the next three verses down through 34 next Wednesday night, but we want to try next week to keep on, again, in this bigger context of allowing yourself to be, the second will be first, the servants will be first. He's going to talk about the kingdom of God and children, and he's going to now use children as an illustration, an example of what this principle or concept he's talking about. And then he's going to talk about wealth with the rich young ruler, who again wants to have the position but doesn't want to bring himself under submission to the king in order to have it. Okay? So we'll begin with verse 13 next week. Before we dismiss, I have a few announcements that we'll talk about, and then Chris is going to come up and lead us in a